Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Against the Odds. So last week on our Against Odds poll, it was Braid of Fire coming out the most dominant winner in any Against the Odds poll I think we've ever had. It just blew away the competition. Everyone wants to see Braid of Fire in Modern. So this week, we are playing a Modern deck built around Braid of Fire. And I have to say going into this, I was really worried. Braid of Fire is not an easy card to build around. It is actually a super hard card to build around, but I'm pretty happy with where we ended up. A quick reminder before we talk about the deck. If you enjoy this Braid of Fire deck and you enjoy Against the Odds, it would be awesome of you if you could just take a quick second, click that subscribe button right down in the bottom corner of your screen. It's a great way you can support the site for free. Anyway, let's talk Braid of Fire. Braid of Fire is this super weird enchantment from Cold Snap, and it has cumulative upkeep, this really archaic ability where you do something at your upkeep, and if you don't pay the cumulative upkeep cost, you have to sacrifice the permanent. So for Braid of Fire, the cumulative upkeep is actually beneficial. It adds 1 red mana to your mana pool, so you play it the next turn when you untap, you get 1 red mana, the next turn you get 2 mana, next turn 3 mana, 4 mana, and so forth. The downside is this is happening on your upkeep, so it's pretty challenging to find ways to use Braid of Fire mana on your upkeep. So the first thing I thought of was probably the most obvious thing. What can you play on your upkeep? You can play instants, you can play cards with flash. So my first thought was we got to get some instants. I looked at like Searing Winds, a 9 mana instant that does 10 damage to a creature or player. Things like that. And I thought about it, it's like, that's kind of cool, but I think we can do better. So really, there's 2 things to consider with Braid of Fire. First is that timing restriction. Gotta figure out a way to get around or make use of mana that comes on your upkeep. Second is Braid of Fire is pretty slow. As I was mentioning before, you play it, the next turn you untap, you only get +1 mana, the next turn 2 mana, so you really want 5 turns, 10 turns, 30 turns with Braid of Fire on the battlefield for it to get really crazy. So that's what we're dealing with. Let's talk about how we went about breaking Braid of Fire. So number 1, to deal with the timing restriction, instead of going all in on Searing Winds and janky instants, we're going with Upwelling. So Upwelling, a 4 mana green enchantment, says mana pools don't empty at the ends of turns or phases. So if we have an Upwelling on the battlefield, whenever Braid of Fire adds mana, we don't lose it when we go to the next step. So even though it produces that mana on our upkeep, we can spend it on our main phase, or we can even store it up for multiple turns if we want to, because that mana just never goes away. Upwelling is symmetrical, so it does impact both players, but as we've talked about with other symmetrical cards, we got Braid of Fire, so we're built around abusing Upwelling more than our opponent. So that's basically the idea. With an Upwelling and a Braid of Fire, all the mana that Braid of Fire makes, we can use it at any time. We're not limited to just casting instants and cards with flash. We can cast stuff on our main phase and anytime we want to, because that mana is just always there. So next, we went really deep. So Braid of Fire makes a lot of mana, but not quite enough mana. So we're storing up this mana from Braid of Fire, getting in our Upwelling, it's sitting in our mana pool. Then we have Doubling Cube, a 2 mana artifact where you can pay 3 and tap it, and you double the amount of mana of each type in your mana pool. So this combo can let us make a really crazy amount of mana. So say Braid gets up to adding 5 mana. So it adds 5 mana to our mana pool. The next turn adds 6 mana. That's 11 mana. We have an Upwelling, so that mana is not going away. We got 11 mana in our mana pool. We have a Doubling Cube. We tap it, pay 3, puts us down to 8 mana, but then it doubles up to 16 mana. And then the next turn we get more Braid mana. We double again. We're up to like 40 mana. Then the next turn we're up to like 80 some mana. So it just spirals out of control, and we can get a absolutely absurd amount of mana with the combination of Braid of Fire, Upwelling, and Doubling Cube. So what are we doing with this mana? Well, first off, we have Staff of Domination. Staff of Domination, one of the problems is we have very few finishers in this deck, a minimal number, and I wanted a way where we could find our finisher. So Staff of Domination, if we make 80 mana, 100 mana, can literally let us draw through our entire deck. So you can do a whole bunch of things with Staff. 2 untap it, you can gain a life. 3 untap it, you untap a creature. 4 untap it, you tap a creature. 5 untap it, you draw a card. Then you can pay 1 to untap it. So basically, 6 mana, draw a card, and you can do that any number of times. Also, we can just use it to like tap down creatures to stay alive, gain life to stay alive. We can gain a nearly infinite amount of life, so we're out of danger of dying to burn. So one thing we do with this insane amount of mana we can make is use Staff of Domination, but after we're stable, we got enough life, we're not dying to our opponent's creatures because we can tap them down, we start drawing cards, and what we're looking to draw into is Genesis Wave. So we have tons of mana, we draw into Genesis Wave, we cast Genesis Wave, equal to the number of cards in our deck, essentially. So if we have 40 cards in our deck, we'll do it x 40 because we're going to have that much mana from Braid and Upwelling. And then we get to look at our entire deck, essentially, and put any permanent cards revealed onto the battlefield. We can also cast it smaller. We can cast it x10, and we look at the top 10, any permanents with converted mana cost 10 or less. So we're getting more of the stuff we've already talked about, but the combo is we Genesis Wave into more doubling cubes. So if we have 1 doubling cube on the battlefield, we go for our whole deck. We're going to get the rest of our 4 doubling cubes. So we're going to have 3 doubling cubes, and we're also going to hit a single copy of Helix Pinnacle and any lands that are left in our deck. So what we do, hopefully we have some amount of mana floating, but it doesn't even matter that much. So we Genesis Wave for our entire deck, hit 3 more doubling cubes, tap all the lands we hit with Genesis Wave, probably already have some mana floating, double that mana with one of our doubling cubes, double it again with the next doubling cube, double it, hit a third time with our last doubling cube, and that should give us enough mana that we just dump 100 mana into Helix Pinnacle, get 100 counters on it, and when we untap the next turn, we just win the game on the spot. So that's kind of the main plan of this deck, is get the Braid out there, make a ton of mana. It doesn't go away because we have Upwelling, and then we can double that mana with Doubling Cube. Eventually, we're going to have enough mana. We Genesis Wave for our entire deck, hit 3 more Doubling Cubes, and 1 Helix Pinnacle, double, 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 get over 100 mana, sometimes way more than that, dump at least 100 mana into Helix Pinnacle, and win the game that way. So that's plan A. We also have some backup plans. One of the sweetest backup plans is we have some fetch lands, we have a Dryad Arbor, a forest that is also a 1/1 creature, and we have a Kessig Wolf Run. So if we don't have a Genesis Wave, all we need is a fetch land, and we have all this mana in our mana pool from our Upwellings and our Braid of Fire. So at the end of our opponent's turn, we sack a fetch, get a Dryad Arbor. On our next turn, all we need to do is tap our Kessig Wolf Run, pour 50 mana into it, and we have a 50-powered Trampling Dryad Arbor to actually win us the game. That's one of our backup plans. The last backup plan is Comet Storm, and this works with the instant speed plan that we were talking about. So Braid of Fire, if we get it up to 10, 20 counters, if we don't have the Upwelling to store our mana, Comet Storm just lets us burn our opponent out at instant speed. We use the mana on our upkeep we produce from Braid of Fire. We can also use it just to wrath away our opponent's board if we can't actually kill our opponent, to help keep us alive and keep our opponent's creatures from dealing damage to us. So those are kind of our 3 plans. Plan A is the crazy doubling season, make over 100 mana, pour it all into our enchantment, win with 100 counters. Plan 2 is to Dryad Arbor with 50 power, 100 power, 1000 power. Plan 3 is Comet Storm to just dome our opponent for lethal. The rest of the deck, we got a bit more ramp. We got Arbor Elf, can work as a backup with our Kessig Wolf Run if we don't go on the Dryad Arbor plan, and Utopia Sprawl. This is just helps speed things up. It lets us play our Upwelling sooner, lets us make sure we have mana to activate our Doubling Cube and all that stuff. And then I mentioned the second problem with Braid of Fire is it takes a while, and that's true. So to slow down the game, we have Blood Moon and Ensnaring Bridge. Basically, these are the cards that allow us to live long enough for Braid of Fire to start making 4 mana, 8 mana, 12 mana by making our opponent's mana bad, plus also keeping their creatures from attacking. And since we're making so much mana, it's pretty easy for us to stay empty-handed with Ensnaring Bridge. As far as the sideboard, there's some spice. One of the spiciest cards is Boom Bust. So, Boom Bust, 2 mana, you can destroy a land that each player controls, one of yours, one of your opponents. 6 mana, it becomes an Armageddon. You destroy all lands. So the idea here is in some matchups, Blood Moon isn't good. In some matchups, we just really want to destroy lands. If we can get a Braid of Fire on the battlefield, and it's ticking up, ticking up, ticking up, we can just destroy all the lands, and we break the symmetry of destroying all the lands because we're continually getting this mana from our Braid of Fire, so we're getting a mana, even though we don't have lands and our opponent isn't getting mana, so we can win that way. Boggart and Hellkite gives us something else we can play at instant speed, since it has Flash. There's very few big red creatures with Flash, but this is the best one. 8 mana, it's a 5/5, you deal 5 damage, divided any way you choose among creatures or players, so it's just a big flying threat. If our opponent kind of sideboards out the removal, we can bring in Boggart and Hellkite and potentially just win the game that way by casting it with Braid mana on our upkeep. Then we have a bunch of artifact hate for Affinity and other decks, Tron and so forth. Crows and Grip can also hit enchantments if that's an issue. Sudden Shock helps against Infect. Anger of the Gods is good against Infect in basically all aggro decks. And then a single Fulminator Mage to deal with Tron and creature lands. And that is Braid of Fire for Modern. So exactly how well this will work, I don't know. I know that Blood Moon and Ensnaring Bridge are good at slowing down the game. Whether or not they're good enough to slow down the game enough to make this crazy Braid of Fire, make hundreds of mana, win with Helix Pinnacle combo actually work, I have no clue. I'm going to say that we win about 30% out of the time, 1 out of every 3 games, something like that. So we'll see. I think it's going to be interesting, and as long as we get to make a ton of mana, hopefully Genesis Wave for our entire deck, and maybe Boom Bust someone out of the sideboard, I will be pretty happy regardless of our mana. I also really want to make a 500 power Dryad Arbor because that just sounds funny. So hopefully we get to do some cool things, even though I'm a little skeptical that our overall record's going to be good. But it should be fun and it should be interesting. So anyway, that's been our deck tech for Braid of Fire in Modern. I hope you enjoyed the gameplay videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you soon.